Hello, people of Grace. Last week we began a sermon series in our Sunday worship services about the parables of Jesus. So I want to take just a moment to talk about parables. In Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, while he was king in Israel, talk about the benefits of wisdom and really all the different facets of wisdom that are mentioned in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. But then it says this is the goal of wisdom in verse 6, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Well, in verse 1 of Proverbs 1, it says the Proverbs of Solomon, the figures of speech of Solomon. And Jesus used figures of speech. That shows up multiple times in the gospel that Jesus is using a figure of speech. And then in verse 6, as Solomon shared these figures of speech, he was then calling for wisdom so that you could understand the proverb, the parable. And so a parable is something that is cast alongside the reality you're trying to get someone to understand so you can understand the reality. And that's what Jesus does with us. When we look at John chapter 3 and Jesus' exchange with Nicodemus, he's using parables there. So you can't really understand directly spiritual truth. So I'm going to use a figure of speech. It's like a baby being born. I'm going to use a figure of speech. It's like the wind blowing. I'm going to use a figure of speech. It's like the serpent that was raised up in the wilderness. All of these things are like the reality of a soul being brought to life with God. So here's the big point for today. Hebrews chapter 9 has the audacity, though we often don't see it, to point out a very important truth. The entire first covenant, the covenant of Moses, is a parable. In Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, he really explains that, but really drives that point home in verse 9. And depending on your translation, it might say it's a symbol. Well, parables are symbols. The root idea there really is the entire first covenant is a parable that was cast alongside so that when the reality, Christ, would show up, he would be understood. And John the Baptist did understand it. When Christ showed up and John saw him, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So that entire Old Covenant, the animal sacrifices and the temple worship, John the Baptist got it and said, oh, here's the reality that this parable that Israel lived through was supposed to help us recognize. That's a beautiful thought because in a way, the human Jesus of Nazareth is a parable of the very word of the Father. He is the living, eternal parable. So it's parables within parables, but all done not to confuse the understanding heart that really desires to connect with God and owns our sin, but to help us understand as much as we can something that is so beautiful and so good that it surpasses all of our understanding. But it touches that fearing part of our soul that actually delights in the presence of God when we get the parable. It really is all about Jesus. Start with him, meditate on him. As Thomas à Kempis so beautifully wrote, imitate him. And then we start to be able to unpack the parables and the power of what they teach us. That's an encouraging thought. I look forward to our study of the parables of Jesus together. Have a blessed day.